There's a quiet kind of weariness that settles in over the years, one that doesn't come from physical labor or late nights, but from the constant unspoken weight of always being present for others. You might not even notice it at first. It begins subtly, like a gentle erosion of your own time, your own voice, your own needs. One phone call here, one favor there. A family member needs help. A friend needs comfort. Someone wants advice, and you offer it, because you always have. There was a woman I once knew, a widow in her 70s, warm and generous, the kind of person who never let anyone feel alone. She had this incredible ability to make people feel safe, just by listening. But over time, something inside her began to fade, not her spirit, but her space. One day, after a particularly long day of helping everyone but herself, she sat down at her kitchen table, placed her hands around a warm mug of tea, and asked, not out loud, but deeply within, "When did I stop showing up for me?" And that question, it stays with you, doesn't it? You see, we live in a world that quietly praises constant availability. We're taught from a young age that being good means being responsive, agreeable, selfless to a fault. But no one tells us that such a life, when unexamined, can lead to a soft kind of self-abandonment. We begin to believe that our value lies in how quickly we reply, how often we say yes, how much of ourselves we offer, even when we're tired, even when we're hurting. But what if the opposite were true? What if the sacred path toward peace didn't begin with saying yes, but with learning when and how to say no? In today's reflection, we'll walk through this exact question. Drawing from timeless Buddhist wisdom, we'll explore why silence can be stronger than explanation, why withdrawing is not weakness, and why in your later years, mindful unavailability is not selfishness, but rather an act of deep spiritual protection. This isn't a call to shut the world out. It's an invitation to finally come home to yourself. So take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and gently settle in. Because when you stop being constantly available to others, you begin to make space for the one relationship you may have overlooked all these years, the one you have with your own soul. Part 1. The illusion of constant availability. Somewhere along the way, many of us came to believe that our worth is measured by how much we are available to others, how quickly we return a phone call, how readily we say yes, how often we show up, even when we are tired, aching, or quietly falling apart inside. We wear our responsiveness like a badge of honor, yet silently carry the weight of emotional depletion that comes with it. And here lies the illusion that constant availability is love, when in truth, it can sometimes be fear in disguise. In Buddhist thought, this compulsion to always be there, to never let anyone down, is a subtle form of attachment, a clinging not to others, but to an identity we've been conditioned to uphold. The Buddha taught, attachment is the root of suffering, and sometimes that attachment is to being perceived as dependable, kind, selfless, even at the cost of our inner balance. Think of the ocean. On the surface, waves rise and crash with intensity, but deep below the water is still. In the same way, our constant reacting keeps us tossed by every emotional tide, while true peace lies in the deeper waters of mindful restraint. I once spoke with a retired teacher in her late 70s. She'd spent her entire life caring for others, her students, her children, her neighbors. I thought if I ever stopped being available, she told me, they'd stop loving me. But when she finally set a boundary, said she couldn't babysit one weekend, didn't answer a late-night call, she was shocked by the resentment she received. That's when I realized they didn't love me, they loved my yes. It was heartbreaking, yet liberating. She had confused her value with her usefulness. Haven't we all? The Buddha also said, you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. Yet we so often forget this, trading self-love for approval, inner peace for the illusion of being needed. So pause and ask yourself gently, have I mistaken being available for being valuable? There is a sacred line between kindness and self-erasure, and only when we begin to honor that line do we reclaim the space to simply be, not for others, not for expectation, but for our own soul's quiet, beautiful unfolding. Part 2. What you lose when you always say yes. It begins innocently enough. A friend calls needing a favor, and you say yes. A neighbor asks for your help, and you smile and agree. A family member needs your time, your energy, your emotional support, and you, of course, show up. But slowly, almost without realizing it, something begins to slip away. At first, it's subtle. Maybe a quiet moment you used to enjoy each morning disappears. Maybe the book you were reading stays untouched for weeks. Maybe the stillness inside you begins to feel more distant, less reachable, and by the time you pause to notice, you're already spread thin, like warm butter stretched across too much bread. In Buddhist philosophy, this pattern, this constant self-abandonment in the name of keeping the peace, is known as craving, tanhas. It's not always a craving for things or praise. Sometimes it's the craving to be liked, to be needed, to avoid confrontation, to maintain the illusion of harmony. But the cost of always saying yes, it's staggering. You lose your solitude, your clarity, your sense of direction. You start living from the outside in. There's a story in the Zen tradition of a monk who kept a small cup beside him. Every morning, he'd fill it with tea, sip it slowly, then pour out whatever was left before noon. When asked why, he replied, "I must not offer others what I haven't savored myself." This gentle ritual was his way of remembering his energy, his peace, his time. These were sacred offerings, not limitless commodities. And yet, how many of us pour from an empty cup every single day? I once spoke to a man in his 60s who spent decades caretaking for everyone around him, his aging parents, his siblings, his grown children. When I asked him what he does for himself, he stared into the distance and whispered, "I don't remember." That sentence haunted me. Because what good is a generous spirit if, in the process, we forget our own face in the mirror? The Buddha reminds us, if your compassion does not include yourself, it is incomplete. Saying no isn't a rejection of others. It is the deepest form of self-respect. It is a way of whispering to your soul, "I see you. I have not forgotten you." You don't owe every moment of your day to the world. You owe it first to your peace. And from that place of peace, you give better, fuller, and more truthfully. Part 3. The sacred power of withdrawal. There is a profound kind of strength hidden in the act of stepping back, not out of anger, not out of pride, but from a quiet recognition that your energy, your presence, and your peace are no longer to be offered without care. This is not avoidance. It is awakening. In Buddhist teachings, this is known as noble silence, a deliberate, mindful withdrawal that creates space for truth to rise. We often confuse withdrawal with weakness. Society teaches us to equate stillness with passivity, but in the Dhammapada, the Buddha says, just as a solid rock is not shaken by the storm, even so the wise are not affected by praise or blame. What if we could become that rock? Not rigid, but grounded, steady in the face of chaos. Not because we fought harder, but because we learned when to step away. There's a story I once heard about an old monk who lived on the edge of a village. He rarely spoke, never argued, and was often seen walking slowly through the forest, head slightly bowed, hands behind his back. When asked why he kept to himself, he answered with a soft smile, "Because the louder the world gets, the more I must listen within." His silence was not emptiness, it was sanctuary. And maybe, for those of us who have spent decades running toward every noise, responding to every call, that sanctuary is exactly what our souls have been longing for. You see, when you withdraw consciously, when you choose not to react, something remarkable begins to happen. People start to reveal their true relationship with you. Were they connected to your heart, or to your availability, your attention, your usefulness? The act of withdrawing doesn't just create space between you and others, it creates clarity. It teaches you where your energy leaks, where your peace is disrupted, where your boundaries are blurred, and it gently invites you to return to yourself, to stillness, to a presence that doesn't need to be explained or defended. In meditation, when the mind wanders, we're taught to return to the breath, not with force, but with tenderness. Likewise, withdrawal is a return to breath, to essence, to that unshaken center within you. And in this world that glorifies noise, distraction, and urgency, maybe the bravest thing we can do is to become quiet enough to hear the soft voice of truth again. Part 4. Boundaries as an act of compassion. At first, the word boundary might sound harsh, rigid, even unfriendly. But in truth, a boundary is not a wall, it is a doorway. And like any sacred doorway, it is not meant to shut people out, but to protect what's sacred within. In Buddhist thought, boundaries are a reflection of wise discernment, knowing not just what is good or bad, but what is skillful, what is nourishing, what leads to peace rather than suffering. One of the most compassionate things you can do for yourself and others is to be clear about where your peace begins and where their expectations must end. There's a story from the Buddha's life that speaks to this. A man once came to the Buddha and began insulting him, shouting angrily, hoping to provoke a reaction. The Buddha simply looked at him calmly and said, "If someone offers you a gift and you do not accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The man, stunned, fell silent. In that moment, the Buddha was not cold. He was clear. He did not absorb what wasn't his to carry. That, dear listener, is the essence of a boundary. Too many of us, especially in our later years, carry burdens that were never ours to begin with. We carry the weight of others' expectations, disappointments, projections, and we call it duty. We give so much of ourselves out of love, and yet we forget that true love is not about being endlessly accessible. It's about being honest, present, and whole. And you cannot be whole when your soul is scattered across 100 small yeses you didn't mean. One woman, in her 60s, told me that she had never said no to her adult children, not once. She feared they would pull away, that they would think she didn't care. But the day she gently told her son she couldn't lend money again, not this time, something shifted. He didn't fall apart. He didn't stop loving her. In fact, he began to see her not just as a provider, but as a person with her own needs, her own limits, her own inner life. You see, boundaries are not the end of love. They are the beginning of real love. Love that breathes. Love that doesn't rely on overextension or sacrifice to survive. In Buddhism, we practice metta, loving kindness. But that kindness must include yourself. Setting boundaries is not selfish. It is metta in action. It is saying, "I love you, and I love me too." So the next time someone asks for more than you can give, pause, breathe, and remember, a boundary said with clarity and compassion is not rejection. It is a gentle way of honoring both souls in the room, yours and theirs. Part 5. Recognizing emotional manipulation. There's a kind of pain that doesn't bruise the skin or break the bones. yet it leaves the heart quietly bleeding. It's the ache that comes from being used, not in obvious ways, but subtly, emotionally, psychologically, even spiritually. It often hides behind soft voices and kind eyes, behind words like, "I just need you," or "You're the only one I can count on." And if you've ever been someone with a big heart, a lifelong giver, then chances are you've felt it. The Buddha once said, "There is no fire like passion, no shark like hatred, no snare like folly, and no torrent like craving." In emotional manipulation, craving is the current and guilt is the snare. People crave your comfort, your support, your attention, but they offer little in return. And the moment you hesitate, the torrent rises. Why are you distant? You've changed. I thought you cared. Here's the truth. Manipulators don't need to shout. They don't even need to ask directly. They just learn your emotional buttons, press them softly, and let you do the rest. I remember speaking to an elderly man who had spent most of his life trying to keep the peace in his family. Whenever someone was upset, they came to me, he said. Whenever there was drama, I fixed it. I thought that meant I was strong, but I was just the one who couldn't say no. He paused, looked down and whispered, "I wasn't helping them. I was just making sure they never had to face themselves." You see, emotional manipulation often looks like dependence, but it's not. It's control wrapped in vulnerability. It's using your empathy against you, and it thrives when we confuse compassion with compliance. From a Buddhist perspective, this is where right view becomes essential, seeing things as they are, not as we wish them to be. The moment you begin to pull back, to protect your energy, to establish boundaries, the manipulator feels exposed, not because you've harmed them, but because you've broken the spell. You've interrupted the cycle, and in their panic, they may lash out, not because you're wrong, but because you're no longer easy to manage. But here's the great paradox. When you stop allowing yourself to be used, you may lose some relationships, but you gain your own reflection back. Clearer, braver, freer. Manipulation cannot survive in the presence of silence. The moment you stop explaining yourself, justifying your no, or rushing to soothe every storm, you begin to see who truly respects your presence and who only valued your obedience. So the next time someone's sadness feels like a trap, or their need feels like a leash, pause and remember, you are not here to be used. You are here to be whole. And wholeness begins the moment you stop mistaking guilt for love. Part 6. Choosing silence over reaction. There's a power we often overlook. It isn't loud. It doesn't try to win arguments or dominate rooms. It doesn't interrupt, defend, or explode. It simply chooses silence. In a world addicted to noise, silence can feel unnatural, even threatening. We've been taught to reply quickly, to prove ourselves, to speak even when our hearts are trembling. But Buddhist wisdom tells a different story. The Buddha once said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." And sometimes, even that one word isn't needed. When you choose silence, especially in moments of tension or misunderstanding, you shift the entire dynamic of the situation. Instead of feeding the fire, you take away its oxygen. You become the stillness others can't quite control. I once heard a story about a Zen master and a young monk. The monk was insulted harshly by another student and asked the master how he should respond. The master replied, "When someone leaves a gift at your door, but you do not accept it, who does it belong to?" The monk thought for a moment and said, "To the giver." The master smiled and nodded. So it is with anger. This lesson stayed with me. So many of us, especially in our later years, carry decades worth of reactions, Old wounds, unresolved conflicts, nights spent replaying conversations we wish we'd handled differently. But silence, chosen mindfully, becomes an act of liberation. It is the gentle refusal to carry what was never yours. And no, this silence is not about suppression or pretending nothing happened. It's not about retreating in fear. True silence, the kind taught in Buddhist practice, is presence without participation, a clarity that sees beyond the surface and says, I don't need to prove myself in order to protect my peace. When you stop reacting to every provocation, when you allow yourself the space between emotion and action, you begin to cultivate what the Buddha called equanimity, upekkha, a serene, unshakable calm in the face of life's noise. At first, people might call you distant, even unkind, but they don't understand the sanctuary you're building, because when you stop explaining every no, stop defending your every boundary, stop participating in dramas that never had anything to do with your soul, that's when you truly begin to own your energy. So the next time you feel pulled into a storm, take a breath. Let silence be your answer. It may not be understood, but it will be respected. And more importantly, it will heal you. Part 7. The loneliness that leads to liberation. There's a quiet hour, often in the late evening, when the house is still, the phone has stopped ringing, and the day has finally let go. For many older adults, that's when the loneliness settles in, like a soft, familiar fog. You sit in your chair, look out the window, maybe hold a warm cup of tea in your hands, and wonder, have I pulled too far away? Have I become invisible to the world I once gave everything to? But what if I told you that not all loneliness is empty? That some forms of solitude, when chosen with awareness, are actually doorways into a deeper kind of freedom. In Buddhism, this is not only accepted, it is revered. The Buddha himself left behind the noise of the palace to walk alone beneath trees and moonlight. He understood what so many of us forget. True liberation often begins when we are finally willing to sit with ourselves. No roles, no audience, no one else to please. The Buddhist term for this is viveka, noble solitude. It's the kind of aloneness that heals instead of haunts. It doesn't mean cutting ties or abandoning relationships. It means being so rooted in yourself that you no longer fear the silence. Because within that silence, something sacred returns. Your inner voice, your clarity, your truth. I once met a woman who, after decades of caretaking and sacrifice, decided in her 70s to move into a small cottage by the sea. Her children were grown, her marriage had ended, and her life felt like a quiet field after a long storm. At first, the silence felt unbearable. I cried every night for the first month, she told me. But then, something strange happened. The silence stopped feeling empty. It started feeling full of presence, full of her own thoughts, her own breath, her own dreams, many of which she had buried long ago under the weight of duty. This kind of loneliness is not a punishment, it's a purification, a clearing away of distractions, so that the soul can be seen again. And yes, it may feel uncomfortable at first, because you are finally facing yourself without the filters of who you are to others. But that is where liberation begins. The Buddha said, "The one who has conquered himself is greater than the one who has conquered 1,000 enemies in battle." And to conquer the fear of solitude is one of the most courageous acts of all. So if you find yourself in a season of fewer calls, quieter days, and more time with your own thoughts, do not rush to fill the space. Let it stretch. Let it breathe, because in that space, you are not disappearing. You are finally returning. Part 8. Emotional sovereignty after 60. There comes a time, usually later in life, when the soul begins to whisper a truth that can no longer be ignored. This is your time now. not in a selfish way, but in a deeply spiritual one. After decades of living for others, raising children, supporting family, saying yes even when it broke you inside, something shifts. And what rises is not defiance, but sovereignty. Emotional sovereignty is not about detaching from love. It's about loving from a place of wholeness. It is the quiet realization that your peace is no longer a negotiable offering to the world, but a sacred inheritance you are finally ready to claim. In Buddhist philosophy, this mirrors the journey of individuation, a term often used in modern psychology, but deeply rooted in the Buddha's path. It's the process of becoming undivided, of no longer needing the approval, validation, or emotional reactions of others to define your worth. The Buddha walked alone not because he disliked others, but because he knew the deepest truths could only be heard in stillness. One retired nurse in her 60s once told me, "I used to feel guilty for not replying right away to my daughter's endless texts. But then I realized I wasn't her emergency line, I was her mother. And sometimes a mother teaches her child through silence too." That moment, that shift in her tone, it was sovereignty, not pride, not detachment, just a calm knowing that her energy deserved intention, not obligation. You see, sovereignty is not about building walls, it's about building an inner temple, a space within you where your emotions no longer get hijacked by other people's storms. It's when someone tries to provoke you and you simply don't react. Not because you're numb, but because you've mastered the pause, the sacred breath between stimulus and response. The Buddha said, "Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without." And in your later years, this teaching becomes more than a quote, it becomes your compass. So if someone accuses you of being distant because you've stopped participating in chaos, let them. If they say you've changed, smile gently, because yes, you have. You've returned to your center. You've stopped offering your soul in exchange for shallow peace. And now, your no carries more truth than your old yes ever did. Emotional sovereignty after 60 means you finally understand not everyone gets access to your spirit. Not every situation deserves a reaction, and not every connection is sacred. Now you choose. You respond when your heart is steady, not when your boundaries are tested. You speak from clarity, not from guilt. You give, not to be valued, but because you are already whole. And perhaps that is the greatest freedom of all. Conclusion. Returning to your inner temple. So here we are, at the quiet end of a journey that in truth is just beginning. We've explored what it means to live a life that is no longer driven by urgency, by guilt, by the relentless need to be everything for everyone. We've spoken about the hidden cost of saying yes too often, the weight of emotional expectations, and the quiet beauty that blooms when we dare to step back, not in bitterness, but in wisdom. And perhaps the most powerful truth of all, when you stop being constantly available to others, you begin to become truly available to yourself. In the stillness, in the sacred withdrawal, you do not lose your value, you recover it. You begin to reclaim your time, your voice, your essence. Now I ask you, gently but honestly, are you willing to be misunderstood, even judged, so that you may finally be at peace? Are you ready to let go of being needed, so you can return to being whole? Because sometimes choosing peace means disappointing others. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to honor your own soul. The Buddha taught, better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace. And sometimes that one word is no. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's the quiet courage to walk away and walk inward. If this message resonates with you, If it stirred something soft but steady within you, I invite you to leave a comment below with the words, "I choose peace." Let it be a small, brave declaration that your time, your energy, and your presence are sacred, not just to others, but to yourself. And if you found comfort in this reflection, I warmly invite you to subscribe to Quiet Wisdom, where each video is crafted to guide you gently home to yourself, especially in these beautiful reflective years after 60. Until next time, be well, be still, and may your peace be louder than the world around you.